now excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is our guy, Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, the best dressed man at SEC Media Days. Did you take that title really without much competition?
Well, I do categorize it differently for TV folks versus writers. Writers mail it in. Honestly, it's a little offensive to me sometimes, the level to which writers mail it in. The thing that I've said, and I have some friends who do this, like when I'm at work, I'm sorry, I'm not doing shorts. I'm just not. Like it's just, especially if it's an event like that. Okay, if you're going out to practice, maybe it's a little different. But like if you're going to an indoor event at a nice hotel, I just can't understand doing shorts. So I will say the way that this all started for me was back when I was a student. You just don't want to be treated like a student, so I would always overdress a little bit. And so now, of course, overdressing for being a student is like wearing pants and a polo, and like now overdressing to being like a professional at a national outlet is like wearing a suit. But it's kind of become my brand a little bit. So this was my first time since 2016 at SEC Media Days, so I'm like, I gotta let people know.
I was going to say, yeah, because I've been going since 2018. I haven't seen you there before, but you can
Yeah.
answer the ultimate question. Like it does just mean more, right?
Well, it does. It does. I mean, the amount of chaos there is crazy. Now, the one that I went to before in 2016 was in Hoover, and that was a whole like other experience. Being in Dallas, it was mostly actually a media event. I saw the like Alabama Hammer guy or whatever when he was like scouting out the place, and he was kind of like, "Wait, where are the fans supposed to be?" And fans didn't really come to the one in Dallas because frankly it's a downtown venue, and coming downtown in Dallas just to like stand outside and watch Kalen DeBoer come in is a little less palatable than driving 10 minutes in Birmingham to Hoover. Like it's just a different kind of experience. But I mean, it's a huge event. Of course, they got the giant SEC network set at the back. They've got so many radio and media and all this sort of stuff. The one thing that I will say, because I did 4 of these this year, I did Big 12, SEC, Mountain West, AAC. The one
Dang.
thing with SEC is that they keep them under lock and key. Like they do not, you cannot even like casually walk up to people or like say hi to even people who you might know who are players or coaches there. It's kind of nuts the level to which that happens. Every other one is much more casual. I've never been to Big Ten. I'm curious if it's a little more like that too. But SEC, man, it is a very, I don't want to call it just like corporatized environment, but it's kind of like that.
I've done the behind the scenes thing with Moorhead in 19 and then Beamer last year going into 23. And you realize how little time is available for everybody to do anything whatsoever. And
Right,
it
right.
does feel very corporate from that standpoint. And it's like, all right, we're gonna be in our main media room from this time, and then our auxiliary room in this time, and then this radio hit. And it's like, oh my gosh, everything is so on schedule because there's so much to be able to fit in. One of those popular topics of discussion, walk-ons, was one of the things that I felt like dominated the conversation, not just at SEC Media Days, but probably all the media days that you were at. You did a great story on CBS Sports. Everybody should go check it out. Just on the future of walk-ons. You talked to the Burlsworth family, what that's going to look like moving forward. The big question that I think everybody wants to know is, why did this House settlement, which now says that there will be 105 scholarship players per roster, why does this ultimately change the fate of walk-ons and make it look like they have a very grim future?
Well, the way that the House settlement changed it is they essentially forced not just football, but most sports to guarantee the ability to get a scholarship, right? So, like, if there's a rostered spot, that player will now have the ability to get a scholarship. That's true in baseball, where it used to be 13 or whatever for 31 spots. Now, every one of the 31 players has a chance to get a scholarship. It's going to be true in basketball as well. Um, so, what that means, though, is that for a school that wants to pay for it, which granted, I think even in the power conferences and even maybe in the power too, the idea of having 120 person rosters and trying to pay for scholarships for all of those spots, maybe that wouldn't have been palatable in the first place. But it creates a major competitive advantage. And, the big difference between the FBS and the FCS level is the scholarship number. It's 85 at the FBS level, it's 63 at the FCS level. It just allows you to have a level of depth and development that you wouldn't get to have other places. And so what they decided to do was, instead of trying to legislate, and another thing too was that they were trying to get around the idea of scholarship limits by using NIL to fill in that gap. There was a story that was pretty widely heard of Cormani McLean, the Florida DB, who is allegedly getting his scholarship essentially paid for with NIL money because they're out of countable scholarships. So in practice, right, it means that that almost anyone is able to get a scholarship. And that's a good thing. And even the people that I talked to and the former walk-ons that I talked to, they said that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we are creating 20 more potential scholarship opportunities across every school in FBS. Again, not everyone will pay it, but it's available if that happens. But what that also means is that essentially now, with rosters being capped at 105 to try to protect that competitive advantage, it means that essentially every one of the 105 players who actually ends up on your roster can be a recruited scholarship player. Means that, like, the instead of going to to Western Kentucky, or instead of going to, I mean, even probably like Illinois, or going to or Texas State, or any of these schools, really, you can be the 103rd guy at Alabama because you can get a scholarship to go there, and there's prestige for getting a scholarship to go there. And also, by the way, you are not going to be the one who thinks, oh, well, I'm 105th on the depth chart. You're going to think that, oh, well, maybe I'm in the mid 70s and I'm in a better position than I actually am. So that's kind of this conflict. And when that happens, it means that the idea of somebody like Brandon Burlsworth, who the Burlsworth Award is named after, who walked on at Arkansas because he's from Arkansas and loved Arkansas in the 90s and developed into an All-American and an NFL draft pick before he was tragically killed in a car accident. It means that, like, that guy who's local to a program, who maybe grew up a fan of the program, I think of like the 12th man at Texas A&M,
Yep.
That guy probably can't do that anymore because his spot would most likely be filled by a scholarship recruited player.
And Luke Falk, I thought, had a great point in your story, talking about, he's like, I wasn't the type of guy that was going to get that scholarship. I wasn't going to stand out in that setting. And I needed to be able to get that opportunity just to get my foot in the door. And then what do you do when you get there? And I used to, see all these kids in the state of Nebraska when I was living there who would feel like that they were going to go to some Division II place or something like that, or maybe they would go to a really small D1 school, and then the Nebraska assistants would come through the state and they would do this tour down I-80, and they would pick all of these kids left and right and be like, hey, you want to be a preferred walk-on? You want to do this? We know that you grew up a diehard Husker fan, and you're going to come and do the grunt work and be the scout team person. Those people are essential. And they are really, really important. And I don't know that 103rd person on a roster who's got a scholarship is going to want to put up with all that stuff too. And then it creates even more fluidity, it feels like, than what we had before.
Well, and one thing that Dubba Sweeney mentioned at ACC Media Days was, do we even want to be managing 105 guys who are all like the level of, and I don't mean this word in a bad way, like the level of entitlement when you are a recruited scholarship player is a different thing than I'm just grateful to be here, right? I just want to kind of try and understand that I'm owed nothing. Well, you are owed something when you're a scholarship football player. And the reality is, right, 22 guys get to be starters on a football team. 44 get to be either starters or primary backups, not getting into specialists. Like, how much of the roster is it that now all of a sudden we're talking about 60 guys who won't be starting or backup position players? Now, it can be used in some positive ways. For example, like for someone who wants to be there and develop for 2 or 3 years, like I think that end of roster development can be a really good thing. But I think that in this era as well, that becomes more tenuous. And one other thing that was brought up to me, and that's been brought up a lot, is this idea that, well, that the way to, if you are Luke Falk, let's say, the way to quote unquote work yourself up is, well, maybe you go to Eastern Washington, or maybe you go to Central Washington, and then maybe Wazoo sees you and you get to go up. Well, at a certain point, right? Like, I think that that's great in terms of, okay, maybe you eventually end up getting this opportunity, but it's also like, I mean, you and I were college students at some point. at what point is it detrimental to just a kid to have to move colleges 3 times in order to get a chance at this opportunity? If Luke Falk didn't make it, like he actually told me a great story that I don't think made it into the piece, but like he was told as a true freshman that he was not good enough to play on scout team, right? But he was like, well, but I'm here. I'm going to university at Washington State. If he had decided to leave football, we could have just been a student at Washington State and gotten a good education, had opportunities after that. And like, I think that one of the things to me that also adds to this process is, yeah, maybe, you know, you can eventually transfer up 2 or 3 times and end up at one of the bigger schools. But like, I feel like we view, especially in the NIL world and now the potentially revenue sharing world, this idea of, well, these guys are professionals, but like for most of these kids, even the really good ones, they're going to be professionals for 4 or 5 years. And so I do think that losing the entirety, essentially, of being a college student during this whole process is also kind of a brutal situation to be in.
Is it possible? Because I know that, you know, as we sit here and you talk about these guys who have been great walk-ons, a Stetson Bennett, a Baker Mayfield, and, you know, these guys that have had these unbelievable paths. And you could talk about the smaller school guys as well. A Cam Ward comes to mind, speaking of Washington State quarterbacks, who starts at Incarnate Word and eventually Washington State, now at Miami, of course. But like, we could talk about all those guys and all the positive stories that go with it. Is there any way that some sort of walk-on program can remain intact? If we can do freelancers in professional work settings, is there some sort of freelancer labor union distinction that can be established to make this a possibility? Because I think if that were an option, coaches would look at the 105 scholarships and go, okay, well, yeah, maybe we could save a few of these open spots for scholars or for, you know, preferred walk-ons to kind of duel it out or whatever. But ideally, I think they would still like some sort of wiggle room to be able to work around that and have a separate contract where these guys are still competing and they could still kind of operate within that walk-on frame.
Well, I think that there's 2 parts to this. One, I do think that the idea of having, let's say, a 95-man scholarship roster, if I'm a coach and deciding this, having 95 scholarship players and leaving 10 spots or something like that in order to make something happen, I think that that is interesting, right? Like the idea of let me just get some guys on campus, and maybe there are 25 kids who go out for walk-ons, and we have 10 spots, and then also we can give them scholarships. We can pay for their school if they earn that opportunity, right? But it doesn't have to be a recruited scholarship player in the way that we talk about. I do think that a big part of whether what you propose might happen comes down to how good the actual enforcement of NIL and laws is going to be, because It's built in to the House v. NCAA settlement that the NCAA does have power to regulate some of these NIL agreements. And you know, under one draft that I know that we've seen, it's alleged that basically any NIL contract that you do over $600, you'd have to report, and then essentially it would be vetted. And I'm sure there'd be a clearinghouse, kind of the way that there is for any sort of NCAA or collegiate benefit. So if that's effective, I think that that makes it a lot more palatable. The idea of, okay, well, we're just going to try to vet this and make sure that we don't have a Cormani McLean situation, which, by the way, like Cormani McLean not doing anything wrong right now. It's totally within the rules for him to do what he's doing, but that we don't have repeat cases of that. But it comes down to what kind of likelihood, I guess you could say, it is that they're able to legislate this and enforce this at a high level. And right now, there's just no track record.
Will walk-ons be extinct by the year 2030? Will we have a last walk-on in college football, someone that can hold that title and be like, wow, there he goes. He's out there lining up on special teams. He's a gunner on special teams or something like that. This is the last pure roster spot in college football history. This thing feels like it's extinct.
I think that I'd make a distinction. I think that at, let's say the biggest schools, right? Let's say the P2 just for shorthand. I think we might be in a position where it's totally extinct by that point. Texas A&M will be interesting because of the history that they have. Nebraska will be interesting. Maybe they dedicate 2 or 3 spots, but they have to understand that they're probably taking on a competitive disadvantage to do so, just to kind of maintain that whatever it is. But I think generally speaking, in the P2, maybe for most of the P4, though I don't think all, I do think that traditional walk-ons will probably not exist in this way. I do think, though, that when you get to the G5 level, especially, I mean, like the reality of like FIU, who's in the news right now because they just partnered with Pitbull. Like, the reality of them adding 20 scholarship players for a program that really doesn't make any real money, I don't know if that's going to be realistic, right? I wonder for schools like that, right? Schools that are, like UTEP, right? Schools like, and even I think up to the AAC level, like is Temple going to pay for 105 scholarship players? I think you can go up and down with this. Northern Illinois, are they going to pay for 105? Probably not. So I think that they'll exist. They probably won't exist certainly the same way at the power conference level. But again, this is one of those things, right? It's like with the rev share, where schools now have the right to pay out potentially up to $22 million, but what percent of schools will actually do it and be able to do it? I think that it kind of could be a situation like that, where the schools that are paying out a full rev share, which again I think will be essentially the entire P2, the vast majority of the P4, and a handful of the G5. I think that those schools will be more likely to try to fill all 105 spots. But I think that other schools will have those spots available. And again, I think that also we talked about Nebraska and kind of their history in the Midwest. I mean, they're kids who, a big part, I would argue, of the Dakota schools exploding right now those are kids that historically might have been preferred walk-ons
Yep.
or partial qualifiers even at Nebraska. But I think that schools like Nebraska really, I mean, kind of that whole Northwest corridor, I think even like a Boise State is interesting. We'll see kind of where Wazoo and Oregon State settle out, but I think that they'll kind of be in that mold as well. I think there will be opportunities available. And I talked to the Burlsworth family, like you mentioned, and one thing that they said is, one, we have no plan at this point to shift this award because right now there are walk-ons, and we're hoping that when this all gets settled out, there will still be walk-ons. And but like I think that ultimately, I mean, this is going to be, I think, more of a stratification within college football. The teams that are willing to pay for 105, but also the teams that are willing to still have walk-ons available.
Let's get you out of here on the latest with Kentucky. All this stuff is oddly connected in a weird way with NIL, what's pay for play, what's not. And I think the average college football fan looked at the news that happened with Kentucky getting the probation, having to vacate wins from the 2021 season for 11 players, just basically not doing the work that they were essentially, paid to do through NIL. We had heard rumblings of this, the suspensions that had happened a couple of years ago. How does this happen in an era when the Tennessee case with Nico Iamaleava was supposed to change everything, and it was supposed to be, well, the NCAA doesn't have any power? Was it just simply Kentucky was so brazen with this, and this was a process that the NCAA had started years ago? Or is there something more to this where the NCAA is just trying to take a last stand?
Well, I think that the question is the NCAA trying to take a first stand in the post-house world, right? Like, are they trying to dip their toe into the water and say, okay, these are very clearly what we would consider to be NIL violations because they very clearly were not for name, image, and likeness. And let's see. Maybe this case gets sued up, but maybe the House settlement in its final form says no. You can enforce this rule, right? So I think that this is in some ways a harbinger. The NCAA believes times have shifted a little bit, and we do have the ability to maybe start to wade back into enforcing NIL and the reality of NIL. But again, I mean, I think that this will probably in one way or another go to the courts. The details will come out. But the other piece that I'll say too is that I'd imagine for the NCAA to pick this one, because Lord knows, look around college football, there's tons of cases, but they must feel like, okay, we have the paper trail, we have the details and the facts enough to make this kind of our first foray back into this.
Does it also matter that, I mean, it feels like Kentucky accepted this punishment, and I can't remember the initial language that was used in the release, but they had basically settled on what this was going to look like with vacating wins, which, say what you will about that, it's stupid. It doesn't really mean that much. But could they have gotten popped a lot worse with this? Could this have been like a multi-year bowl ban, which seems impossible to happen in the mid-2020s?
Well, and that's one of those things where you wonder. I mean, actually, one question that I'd have too for Kentucky, and this is like a truth serum type thing that they never admit, but like, what kind of precedent does this set if you're Kentucky for your peers who are clearly breaking, what we consider to be norms, right? Like, it does setting a precedent of saying, okay, well, one, these are the punishments, and look, they're not that crazy, right? Like, vacating wins, it is what it is, it's whatever. But like, to kind of find a reasonable resolution for your individual self, but also set a precedent that, hey, we're kind of setting back up the idea that the NCAA can actually enforce these cases when you are recruiting against Georgia and Alabama and LSU and Texas A&M. Is that a trade-off that they're willing to at least consider whenever they're going through this process? I think that at the end of the day, right, the NCAA created this negotiated resolution situation to try to get this sort of thing over with, right? Now it's over. There's nothing hanging over Kentucky football because they've of course agreed to this negotiated resolution. But I'm going to be curious to see whenever the next one comes, and certainly if it's a school that's much bigger and maybe more valuable and more important and more willing to fight something like this, like Tennessee, like you mentioned, was among them. I'll be curious to see what kind of precedent ultimately gets set, even if those cases go to the legal system.
And I'm just asking this hypothetically, of course, will the NCAA go after a school that wears T-shirts that say "We pay players" on them?
I wouldn't know the first thing about a school like that. No, I mean, I'm fascinated, right? Because like, Dave Aranda is being very upfront about the fact that, like, we're paying players. Now, I'm also curious. I don't think certainly that quote was, I don't think that it was especially calculated per se. I think it was like, Dave Aranda, I don't know if you've talked to him, he's a very forthright guy. But I think that there's also probably some thought within the program, within the conversations that they're having, and at other schools certainly, that, well, there's an acknowledgement in the House v. NCAA that, like, that rev share is coming. And so is the NCAA, because to me that would be more of a like last stand, right? Of being like, oh, well, yes, you're and I got to talk to some of Baylor's administrators, and they feel like, hey, we have deliverables that we can show that this is not just like that we have plausible deniability, like all of these people are looking for, right? But I think that when you ultimately look at this, right, I think that there is this understanding that the House case means that rev share is on the way, that direct payment is on the way. And so is this a fight that the NCAA is going to care about all that much? Especially when, again, then they'd have to get into the weeds of it and all this sort of thing. So it would certainly be a very symbolic case. I'd be curious, right, if in a pre-House world, before this case was ultimately settled, if Baylor and that coaching staff would have been, let's say, so brazen about it. But I do think that we're probably past that mattering at this point.
I love it. Let's just have everybody come out with "We pay players" shirts. Let's what a statement that would make to the NCAA. Just week one, everybody wearing those T-shirts and stuff. Oh gosh, that'd be incredible. Shehan, this has been great, man. Really good stuff. Like I said, everybody go check out the walk-ons piece, CBS Sports. Lots of great stuff, I'm sure, coming out to you throughout all fall camp and all the season. We got a football season that's just about here. It's crazy.
I'm just about done talking about NCAA resolutions and House settlements, and I'm ready to talk about, hey man, is Colorado's offensive line any good? Like,
you already talked about that. You already had a story on that.
I never. When it comes to offensive line development, I never take a week off.
That's true. Exactly. Love it, man. We'll do it again soon.